Pikmin was always an alluring series to me. I learned about it in my tween years thanks to playthroughs online, and while I enjoyed the aesthetics and overall vibe of the games when I watched, there was always talk about the difficulty of a certain entry, to the point where I was perfectly okay with not playing it for the longest time. Also, I straight up never owned any home console of my own until the Switch, which did allow for more time for my prefrontal cortex to develop so I could achieve maximum Dandori potential. Now that I've played every main entry, at each entry's launch on Switch, here's my thoughts on each one chronologically, after I explain the general gameplay loop. The Pikmin series has an overall consistent gameplay loop and structure. Crash land on a strange planet, conveniently encounter a group of Pikmin, and use said Pikmin to gather that game's collectibles. In Pikmin 1, it's parts for your damaged ship. In Pikmin 2 and 4, it's various treasure, and in Pikmin 3, it's various fruit. To collect them, you must bring these items back to your base by instructing your Pikmin to carry them. But there may be various kinds of enemies on the path between the base and said items. Therefore, you must also use your Pikmin to defeat said enemies. And while they can and do crush, eat, and generally massacre your Pikmin, bringing back their corpse will propagate more Pikmin, along with the pellet posies that you can harvest for even more Pikmin. Matching the same color pellet to the same color Pikmin onion produces more Pikmin than mismatching colors. All 4 games have a day system, and those days have a finite amount of time, roughly around 13 minutes. If any Pikmin are outside your base or squad when the day is done, they are left to die on the planet's surface after you launch into orbit for the night. While 2 and 4 let you take as many days as you need, 1 and 3 have a finite amount of days you're allotted to complete the game. But it varies for each game, we'll go into the details later. You don't have to be perfect. If you're always making some kind of progress, you're honestly fine. With that out of the way, let's start with Pikmin 1. The first game sees Captain Olimar recollecting all 30 parts for his crashed ship before his life support ceases to function in 30 days. You should immediately recognize that if you collect at least 1 part a day, you'll be fine. That being said, you only need 25 parts for an okay ending, but the game doesn't say which parts are optional until after the credits. This doesn't really matter, as during my 2 runs I only needed about 20 days each, which ends up being around 5 hours of playtime. This is accounting for some days where I didn't even collect a single part. It's to the point that I'd say the day limit is a non-issue if you're actually making progress towards collecting ship parts each day. That being said, if you have a day with, say, copious amounts of Pikmin death, don't be afraid to reset, and there will be no shortage of Pikmin deaths, especially if it's your first time, but also just because of the amount of rough edges this game has. If you have a large squad like this, you see how large of a surface area they take up? This makes taking them over bridges or ramps irritating, as it's very likely that someone isn't gonna line up right and just end up getting separated from the group, or end up in the water, in which they will promptly drown if they're not blue. Granted, the swarm function can alleviate this, which you do in the switch ports of 1 and 2 by holding L and tilting the right stick, but it still makes traversing ramps and bridges more nerve-wracking than they really should be. Thankfully, this is fixed in 2 somewhat, and pretty well alleviated in the later entries, but it's still bothersome nonetheless. While this is a nugget of wisdom to take with you into the whole Pikmin series, it's especially applicable to 1 due to its rough edges. You will have at least some Pikmin die, and that's okay. Over a playthrough, as long as you're collecting a good amount of corpses to propagate more Pikmin, you will have an excess of Pikmin going into the endgame. On to the balance of Pikmin types. In this first entry, we have 3. Reds are fire resistant and deal more damage than the other types. Blues can traverse water thanks to their gills, it just looks like a mouth. And yellows can be thrown higher than the others and can carry bomb rocks, which can break down walls and defeat enemies a lot quicker. All 3 types feel equally useful in my opinion, seeing as a number of parts are accessible from the water or from higher up or behind fire hazards. Although reds overall feel like the most useful type thanks to their heightened combat potential. It is kind of odd that only yellows can pick up bomb rocks, but if any type could do so, yellows would only be good for higher up objects, and there aren't too many of those, so letting them use bomb rocks feels like the right call. If plucked right away, Pikmin will sport a leaf on their head, but this can mature into a bud, then a flower, via either feeding them nectar from grass or by leaving them in the ground for a while before plucking. The more mature a Pikmin, the faster they move, break things down, and the faster they attack. Switching between them is a whole thing though. While holding the throw button, you use R to cycle through them, but when switching, the types have to physically move to Olimar in order to be thrown. This means if you quickly switch to one type, you may end up throwing another type if they don't switch quickly enough. Basically, when switching, wait until that type gets closest to Olimar before you start throwing. This is also an issue in 2, but not in the others. Combat has unique wrinkles in these first 2 titles that the later games don't have, namely in regards to having a larger squad of Pikmin. If you engage an enemy using a larger group, that's gonna make it easier for baddies to kill them, as it's a larger surface area of targets that they can aim for. Unlike 3 and 4, there's no lock-on in 1 and 2, so you have to make doubly sure that you're aiming where you need to. Considering how you have to be more mindful when you have a larger squad, and with how switching types is diegetic, this first game, and to some extent the second game as well, feels like you need to take things a lot more slowly and more deliberately than you have to in later titles, which is ironic considering the time limit. In regards to these switch ports of 1 and 2, you can play with total button and stick controls as well as motion aim, which does allow for better precision when throwing, but the motion cursor is only active when holding the throw or whistle button. This is in comparison to what I was used to in 3, as I always used the free reign cursor. But this limited cursor actually grew on me? So the biggest downside to the free cursor on 3 Deluxe is that it frequently got out of sync of how you're actually holding the controller, which requires not just an extra button press to reset, but extra mental energy to remember that you need to occasionally reset it. With this hybrid method, it essentially auto-resets when you stop throwing and start moving, so I eventually forgot that I had to reset it before, and when I went back to replay 3 for this video, I used the hybrid gyro and stick aim for the cursor. The switch ports also have group swarm on the right stick when holding L. This is used for ambushing a critter with a lot of Pikmin all at once, or for quickly carrying something. I've seen some Pikmin veterans criticize this, as the GameCube versions had swarm on the C stick, and to freely rotate the camera, you held L while using the left control stick. Honestly, the Switch controls make way more sense in this modern age compared to the GameCube controls. The natural inclination for modern games is left stick move, right stick camera, bullshit everywhere else. Which is why people, myself included, did not like the scheme of Skyward Sword's stick controls on Switch. The right stick was for normally moving your sword, and holding a button let you look around, even though I was able to adjust to it. And yeah, at the end of the day, it comes down to muscle memory, and that can be changed and trained. Fun fact about the Switch ports of 1 and 2, hold down the Y button when taking Pikmin in and out of the onion. This will let you take 10 out at a time, and just speed up the whole process of interacting with onions. A personal and honestly inconsequential nitpick that I have with the Switch ports of 1 and 2, as well as the new Play Control ports on Wii, is that the game itself is properly shown in the modern 16:9 aspect ratio, but most of the UI elements, menus, and by extension text are shown stretched, just like if you were to take the GameCube versions from their 4:3 ratios and stretch them to 16:9 like a heathen. Looking at the elements in 4:3 just feels so much more correct in my eyes. I'd have been fine if they didn't stretch the menus, and maybe just made the UI smaller and more spread out to compensate, but also in the moment-to-moment gameplay, I don't think about it. So overall, while I have qualms with the less polished aspects of 1, I still had fun with it on both my playthroughs so far. Because it is such a short game, I can see myself booting it up if I want to play something over a longer weekend afternoon and finishing it by bedtime. It's almost like 2D Metroid with its subtle nudges to replay. You have a clock showing your final clear time in Metroid, and Pikmin has a full-on scoreboard with all of your attempts. There's even a challenge mode if you really want to push yourself, but honestly, it's skippable. Much like how some folks think that the next Pikmin game is so bad, you shouldn't play it. Pikmin 2 starts with Captain Olimar returning home from the events of 1, to see that the company he works for is in deep debt. The bottle cap he brought back as a souvenir for his kids gets detected by the new ship his boss got as being worth more than a year's salary. Olimar, now joined by his coworker Louis, returns to the strange planet PNF 404 to collect all of the treasure they can possibly get their hands on. Even though you have this debt hanging over your head the whole time, it's like the house debt you have in Animal Crossing. You have no day limit to pay it back. And because that's the whole crux of this game, you have no day limit. There's still a time limit to each day, but you can take all the days you need. This is also the first game in the series that gives you 2 captains to control. While it's great that this allows for better multitasking, as you can basically be in 2 locations at once, considering that there's no day limit to worry about, it just feels superfluous. Why give tools to be more efficient if there's no real need to be efficient outside of hardcore players who are going to aim to use the fewest amount of days possible anyways? This doesn't even allow the game to be played in co-op with a friend. There are co-op and versus modes in the game, but the main game itself can't be played in tandem with someone else. Plus, if you're actually trying to use both captains effectively, you have to move both of them manually. That may seem like a yeah, no duh point, but this was streamlined in later games. I still appreciate them in regards to the caves, but I'll touch on that in a second. A new addition that became a series mainstay are spicy sprays. In the overworld, you find these berry plants, which you harvest with your Pikmin. Bringing back 10 berries earns you a spicy spray, which when activated with the D buttons, will temporarily max out the speed of your current Pikmin squad, meaning they can break things down faster, they move just as fast if not faster than flowered white Pikmin, which are new to 2, and they'll attack enemies even faster. You'll also find bitter sprays, which are found from similar plants. Pressing its corresponding D button when you're close to an enemy will turn them into stone for a bit, making them easier to take down. Although there are 2 caveats. If a stoned enemy is defeated, they will drop nectar instead of a corpse, and an enemy's defense will subtly increase a bit when stoned. While spicy sprays were brought to future games in their original incarnation, bitter sprays were retooled into different forms, because these things can be incredibly overpowered if you know what you're doing. Not to mention that in 2, sometimes sprays will be given out as droplets, and there's an easy exploit to perform with these. This will give you 2 sprays instead of just the intended 1. Also, remember how this game has no day limit? Use that to your advantage and take some days here and there to just farm up sprays. It's kinda dumb to not do that if you're not going for a fewest possible days run. And you'll need all the sprays you can get, as most of Pikmin 2's gameplay takes place in 14 different caves. Time stops when you're in a cave, so no need to worry about going fast. Most of the time. These are a series of floors that can contain both copious amounts of treasure as well as creatures to get in your way. But not every floor is the same on every run though. Basically, the game takes certain terrain pieces and elements, stitches them together, and gives you some weird amalgamation. Because of this, it's tricky to develop things like puzzles or unique mechanics for the caves, meaning most of the caves, and by extension this game overall, has an even larger focus on combat, and much longer runtime compared to Pikmin 1. These caves are perhaps most infamous for how brutal and difficulty they can get, like throwing a lot of tougher enemies at you, having esoteric level design due to the generation, a copious amount of falling bombs that just drop out of nowhere, or some combination of those blended together into a smoothie that is off-putting to a lot of folks, but is an acquired taste by some. I drink it and I just have to sit there for a good minute to really understand what's going on, and while I can appreciate what it's going for, it's not my first choice in the grand scheme of things. That being said, there's some things to keep in mind when spelunking. When going to a next floor, all Pikmin that are currently alive will follow you, even if they're not in your squad. You don't have to collect all treasures all in one go. You can always pass some up if it looks too dangerous for your current squad, like if you don't have enough to deal with an elemental hazard, or if you're just low on Pikmin, seeing as most caves don't let you increase your squad numbers, and running out of Pikmin forces you to abort the cave completely and leave all collected treasure behind. If you want to bank everything you've collected, you can always skedaddle when you see an exit geyser, albeit you have to tread through all the floors again, but you can reconfigure your squad if needed. And also, the game will auto-save between floors, meaning if you get absolutely curb stomped, you can just Yeah, it does take a minute or two to reload, but it's always an option. Also, as long as you don't need Pikmin to break down any walls or dig up the hole to the next sub-level, you can position one captain at the exit while you do things with the other, so as to make a quick escape if needed. The falling bombs and boulders that appear in caves are honestly overblown. They only appear in a handful of floors, and the sum of all subfloors in all the caves is a little over 100, so in the grand scheme of things, they aren't that big of a threat. Plus, if you zoom the camera out all the way and set it to be top down, you can see them spawn in above you, which gives you an extra second or two to react. Speaking of making things harder on yourself, I've noticed that many first-time playthroughs that folks have been doing here on YouTube or Twitch make things unnecessarily difficult on themselves by just forgetting you can reload your save or do several runs through a cave, therefore meaning they try to get everything all in one go, and only do multiple passes through a cave if absolutely necessary in the event of, say, a squad wipe. And while yes, that can make for some humorous moments, don't take their experiences as representative of the actual difficulty of the game. In general, these sorts of online playthroughs of any game should only be consumed for the intent of entertainment, and are oftentimes not representative of the average gameplay experience. On to Pikmin balance. This game introduces a new elemental hazard, electricity. Yellows are immune to it, but anyone else? Instant death. This incarnation of electricity is the most deadly, regularly occurring hazard in any Pikmin game, as there's a period with other hazards to let you whistle your troops back to safety, but with this, they're dead on frame 1. This means you have to be especially cautious when approaching anything electric. This game introduces 2 new types. White Pikmin are resistant to the also new poison hazards, have a 6th sense of where buried treasure is, and are the fastest when it comes to carrying. And if they're eaten by a creature, they'll deal some damage back, seeing as they themselves contain poison. Purple Pikmin are not strong to any elemental hazards, but they have the carry strength of 10 Pikmin, and are frankly overpowered in combat due to their increased girth. The increased impact deals more damage, and has the chance to stun a creature upon impact. Even though they're the slowest moving Pikmin, their combat potential in this already combat-heavy game makes them a necessity to have with you whenever you can. And if you make good use of your sprays in tandem with purples, you can take down most enemies relatively easily. These 2 new types are only available in caves, which require converting whatever Pikmin you already have with you. There are certain caves that give you solid amounts of these 2 types, so just like with the sprays, take some time to farm up at least 100 of each type when you have a good chance. Purples feel the most useful because of their combat potential. The rest feel roughly about the same level of usefulness. Perhaps the yellows have a mild edge due to how deadly electricity is. Some caves feature bulb orbs, which are accompanied by bulbmen. Upon taking down the bulb orb, whistling the bulbmen will add them to your squad. Bulbmen act just like any other Pikmin, but they aren't affected by any elemental hazard, including electricity. While I understand why folks love them, they really don't show up often enough for me to really care about them a whole lot. Yeah, they can certainly be useful in certain caves, but they can't follow you out of a cave. So in order to get the most out of them, you gotta convert them to another type via a candy pop bud. Overall, Pikmin 2 tries to mix things up with the caves, but with how combat heavy they are, and with how some sublevels and whole caves can have frankly bad layouts, it gets to the point in the late game where I just kinda wanted to be done with it. I do think the difficulty is overblown online, but it's not a cakewalk either. You have to be okay with doing some spray and purple Pikmin grinding here and there, as well as resetting in order to save yourself some time and sanity in the game's latter half. I do think the best way to play any Pikmin game is to go for 100% completion, which I did do for all the games, including 2. And while I appreciate the different direction they took with 2, it's not my first choice when wanting to play a Pikmin game. Combat is just one part of the whole Pikmin experience. Focusing on primarily that, while completely ditching the time management aspect of 1, was not the right call in my opinion. I know the hardcore audience loves 2, to the point where it's the entry that has the most fan mods out there to make it even harder, but I'd rather just play the next game in the series. Pikmin 3 sees Alf, Brittany, and Charlie setting out for sustenance for their planet Kopai, because they straight up ran out of food, which they extract the seeds from to bring back home, and also juice them down as their temporary food supply while they're exploring. The crash landing not only temporarily scatters the captains, but also dislodges the cosmic drive key that the ship needs in order to achieve warp speed needed to reach Kopai. This juice ends up serving as your day limit that you're working against in the pursuit of the drive key. As long as you've made a bottle by the end of the day, you get to proceed to the next day. If not, you must reset to a previous day. Honestly, I think this is a much more interesting way to do a day limit compared to one, as if there's a stretch where you make little progress, that'll put a strain on you in the late game. Although if you're always collecting fruit every day, you're gonna have an excess supply anyways, to the point where you won't have to worry about running out. So while my launch playthrough was on hard mode, which is basically just the Wii U game's difficulty, and normal mode is effectively the easy mode, the 2.5 playthroughs I've done since then have been on the all-new ultra spicy mode that's exclusive to the Switch port. In essence, you get half the juice from fruit, effectively meaning you have a 50-day limit to finish instead of 100. Pikmin also drown faster, and you only have a max of 60 Pikmin in the field instead of the standard 100. While ultra spicy may not be for newcomers, you can't even select it for a first playthrough if you're not importing save data from the demo, I really do think it's the best way to play the game considering the other difficulties are still on the easy side for experienced players. A large focus in this game is on actual multitasking, as opposed to 2's half step of 2 captains you still have to move manually. In 3, you can straight up point on the map where you want a captain to go, and they'll automatically move to that point, so you can still get things done with the other captains. This is somewhat balanced by having an automated captain move more slowly than if the player was controlling them themselves, but in practice it really doesn't matter a whole lot. That being said, I think 3 captains is a little too much to work with effectively. At most, I can use 2 in tandem with little issues keeping track of things. So I just kept the 3rd one at the base as a way to just grab Pikmin that were done carrying things to where I felt like they needed to go next. That's especially clutch when dealing with Ultra Spicy's reduced Pikmin limit. All of the onions fuse into one as the game goes on, meaning you only have a single menu to deal with instead of 5 separate ones like in 2. Thank you. Also, a single Pikmin cannot guzzle down a whole drop of nectar by itself. Thank you. In regards to the improvements made in the Switch version, you can call back idle Pikmin back to your base if you're by the ship. This doesn't work for every Pikmin. Like if there's some assigned to gathering spicy berries, they'll just straight up ignore it. Why? If I want to call back all my Pikmin back to base, this should be able to interrupt everyone and bring everyone back, no questions. Thankfully, 4 fixed this with its homesick signal item, as it does call back every single Pikmin. The Wii U version introduced a charge move you could use upon locking onto an enemy, and while you can still do that here in Deluxe, you don't need to lock on whatsoever. Just pressing X will have the currently selected Pikmin type charged to where your cursor is pointed. Speaking of the cursor, you can either have it move in tandem with your character a la the GameCube originals, be completely independent from the stick and controlled with motion, or a hybrid of the two where larger movements are done with the left stick and you do fine adjustments with motion. Like many people out there, I used to feel that full motion was the best method, but I've always been annoyed at how much the cursor can start floating in one direction. This means that, when playing, a part of my brain was assessing when I needed to hit calibrate to fix it. While I used pure stick control when playing handheld, I never dabbled with the hybrid scheme. It wasn't until the Switch ports of 1 and 2, as well as the release of 4, that I went back to try it, and I think it's my preferred way to play now. Yeah, you may not have as much reach as pure motion, but especially considering you have lock-on, as well as a huge whistle range to compensate, now I'm not thinking of calibration whatsoever. It's apparently bugged in some ways, but when I was just playing the game, I did not notice anything out of the sort. Also, the toggles you use to switch between the 3 modes are stupid. This is pure stick controls, this is hybrid, and this is pure motion. It should not be this visually confusing. One thing about the controls that I don't like is Pikmin switching. Assuming you're not using pure motion, L and R are used to switch types, but it does not feel right whatsoever. Pressing L doesn't move the selection to whatever's immediately to the left in the rotation, it moves the rotation to the left. Same goes for the right button. It doesn't cycle to the rightmost selection, it moves the rotation to the right. This was one of the things that was fixed in 4, and I was able to readjust to this when revisiting 3 again. It's still just dumb though. This is also the first game in the series where you don't have to wait for your selected Pikmin type to get close to your captain before you can throw it. As long as it's selected, you can just start throwing. Your squad also isn't taking up a large amount of surface area anymore. Each type bunches up next to each other, meaning your squad is just more compact. I can see why some folks prefer the way 1 and 2 did it, as there was an actual drawback to having a larger squad out, which is that your squad was more susceptible to attacks. But particularly Pikmin 2 has some questionable enemy and environment setups in caves, so I'm not really sure that making things even more unfair at points with a more spread out squad was really the best call to begin with. On to Pikmin balance. We have red, blue, yellow, all with their previous attributes, except now any Pikmin can carry bomb rocks. Purple and whites are only in mission mode and are now replaced in the story mode with rock Pikmin, who can shatter crystals as well as deal more damage in one throw, with the drawback of being unable to latch onto critters, making them feel like a more balanced purple. There's also wings, who can reach things other Pikmin can't get to, as well as carry things on routes that the others can't take due to their lack of flight. They're easily the weakest in normal combat, but are obviously the best in aerial combat due to their not lack of flight. Electricity no longer insta-kills. Thank you. Blues are absolutely shafted in this game. You encounter them after all the other types, and if you're just going for a credits roll, there's not a huge gap between their first encounter and the final area. That being said, a lot of fruit is only accessible in or over bodies of water, so they really intended for the player to just blitz through the game, get all 5 types, then backtrack to all the previous areas for completion. But that doesn't mean that the way that the blues were placed in the main sequence of events still feels off. There has been some digging done in that regard, and there was actually supposed to be a whole new area to explore after collecting blues, so this odd timing was likely due to this whole area just being scrapped. The improvements to Pikmin AI are much appreciated, especially with things like berry plants or building a bridge. You can just throw a couple Pikmin on and they'll automatically bring things back and forth on their own, as opposed to needing to be collected again. Granted, when they're done, they auto go back to where the task is, meaning you have to go back to collect them again. This was changed in 4, so then they'll stay at base when this kind of task is done, meaning they're inherently safe at the end of the day, which I think is way better. A change made to all enemies is that there's a hard-coded limit as to how many Pikmin can die with one attack. This is in contrast to the other 2 games, where theoretically your whole squad could get wiped out by a single blow from certain enemies. I get this was more challenging without the cap, but it makes the game way more enjoyable and approachable to newcomers, and I think that's what counts most with a matter like this. Granted, it would have been cool if this limit was higher or non-existent in Ultra Spicy for some added zest, but c'est la vie. While I'm not gonna show or say anything specific, this game has my favorite final lead up to the final boss of the whole series. It really puts your multitasking, situational awareness, as well as your gutsiness to the test. But I just wish there was more to that lead up to the final boss. It just felt too short. The story mode does admittedly feel easier compared to 1 and 2 for a number of reasons. The hard-coded limit, the increased day limit compared to 1 if you're collecting enough juice, and the overall better Pikmin AI coding that can make things feel more dull compared to 1 and 2. But I think this is just the game getting overdue quality of life changes that made the other games more difficult than they needed to be at times. The real difficulty is in mission mode. Mission mode is split up into 3 categories: collect all treasures and enemy carcasses within the time limit, defeating all enemies within the time limit, or defeating a story mode boss in the time limit. Completing the objective before time is up earns you a platinum rank on the mission. If time expires, you're graded on how much you did. The treasure collecting specifically can be downright devious when going for platinums. I've had to replay some of these countless times before getting platinum. I think these are a way better way to gauge someone's Pikmin skill compared to 2's combat-heavy caves. Combat is just one part of the whole Pikmin gameplay loop. Pikmin 4 starts with Olimar crash landing again, and collecting his ship parts that were dislodged from his ship again, and upon gathering enough of them, he sends out an SOS signal, which is picked up by the Rescue Corps, who also crash land on the same planet. The game sees your own custom character gathering not just the stranded Corps members, but additional castaways stranded on the planet. You collect treasure to extract its sparklium, which your ship uses to strengthen its search potential, which allows you to explore more areas. This is without a doubt the Pikmin game with the most cutscenes and dialogue of any game if we're not counting every treasure collect cutscene in 2, especially with how tutorial heavy the first hour or so can be. Granted, you can just mash plus or minus to skip past these if you just don't care. That has to do with this game's focus on a bigger story than previous games, and how you aren't so isolated from other characters like in previous titles. Without delving into specifics, it's unclear where this game takes place in the Pikmin timeline, as it seemingly goes against and retcons various plot details from prior games. I'm not one to talk about this with any authority, as I've not entrenched myself in the deeper lore that can be read into. I just generally focus on gameplay unless the story is a major part of the experience, like in a visual novel. This game takes the structure from Pikmin 2, where there's no day limit and you're collecting treasure. Caves also return, but now time does pass when spelunking, albeit at a sixth of the normal speed. But you'll never run down the clock all the way when underground, so feel free to take your time. The caves are not generated like they were in 2. They're the same layout and everything on every playthrough, so the designers were actually able to put in some puzzle solving. The thing that stood out to me the most with 4 is how many quality of life features and tools you have compared to previous games. Without delving into all of them, they make playing the game way more enjoyable. Even the little ones, like how if a group of Pikmin is done carrying back a pile of raw materials or gold nuggets, they'll stay put at base instead of the location of the pile, so you know they'll be safe. Or how if you're mashing throw onto an object, you'll automatically stop throwing when you've thrown the exact number of Pikmin needed to carry the object. Or how when entering a cave, you can just choose your squad loadout there and then. Or how spicy sprays affect all Pikmin on the field, not just the ones currently in your squad. Or how throwing Pikmin onto nectar will default to throwing leaves than buds. Or how Pikmin pathfinding AI is even better than it was in 3. Or how you can set up the D buttons and stick click to different shortcuts to the different tools, like the idler's alert that makes any idle Pikmin go to where you signaled it. That last one was something I barely used in my first playthrough. I kinda ended up playing the game without the new tools like that, or the survey drone that can give you a real-time overhead perspective. But now, I know just how useful they can be, and they make things feel way smoother and let you focus more on just your planning. If you happen to get absolutely slaughtered, you can straight up rewind to go back certain increments of time. I'd say this is overpowered, but at the end of the day, you control the buttons you press, so you can just not rewind and play the game straight. This is really helpful for newcomers to feel more willing to try new and different things without too much fear of being set back in some way, or as an easy way to reset things if you have a mass exodus. Though likely the most infamous feature to this game is auto lock-on. Pikmin 3 had a feature to let you lock your cursor to an enemy or object to make movement and throwing at the same time easier, but you had to engage it by hitting the trigger. Here in 4, your cursor will, against your will, snap right onto whatever object's closest. You can even prevent it from moving off a thing by hitting the trigger to make the auto lock-on stay locked onto that item until you move completely out of range. I've heard and seen countless folks complain about it, and I certainly wasn't the biggest fan of it myself for a time, but before I knew it, I just got used to it and started to base my movements and strategies around the auto lock-on. I know that's not a great solution, but if my mushy brain can adapt to the lock-on, it shouldn't be hard for the layman to get used to it. Instead of multiple captains, you have your own custom character and Ochi. While your main character is like any previous Pikmin captain, Ochi is part captain, part Pikmin. Ochi can headbash enemies and take chomps out of them. He can help carry things back. He can carry the whole squad on his shoulders, which is great to keep everyone grouped up in combat, but also for letting you carry Pikmin across water as he can swim. And bashing into an enemy with a squad of Pikmin launches them all all onto the foe at once. You can use him as a second captain for increased multitasking. He is the best boy, and you should have one of your shortcuts set to switch captains so you can better take advantage of his Dandori potential. He can make things a little easy at points, but like I said, with the new tools, you can just use the traits as little as possible. I do appreciate that we only have 2 captains. 3 felt a little overwhelming at points, especially in missions where I never felt like I was taking full advantage of them. 2 just feels like the sweet spot. Not only are 3's missions back, as well as a timed versus mode, they're part of the main story mode now, under the names Dandori Challenges and Dandori Battles. This is the game where Dandori becomes synonymous with Pikmin. The challenges specifically are noticeably easier to platinum than the missions in 3, but I am not complaining. I've still yet to platinum all the missions in 3. Beating one of these Dandori caves gives you a castaway to bring back to base, and you can also find castaways in some normal caves. The ones rescued from Dandori caves must be demummified of their leaves by harvesting glow sap in the all-new night missions. These are standalone tower defense stages, where you use the new glow Pikmin to defeat the enemies that are ambushing the luminols that contain the glow sap. If a null is destroyed, you must restart. You can grow your squad of glow boys by collecting glow seeds, and doing this makes you realize that glow Pikmin will just teleport back to your active captain when that glow Pikmin is done with a task. You'll not only get glow sap from beating a night mission, but some of your squad becomes glow seeds, which let you spawn in more glow Pikmin in not just other night missions, but normal caves as well. This is super helpful, as they're 4's equivalent to Bulbmin, meaning they're strong against all elemental hazards, but they'll be left behind when leaving a cave. Night missions are overall a fun distraction, but they're a bit easy considering you can make Ochi guard a luminol, and how a larger group of glow Pikmin can just obliterate anything in their path. A major addition to 4 is the upgrade system. Previous games would have various upgrades to your captain scattered throughout different areas, but now you can pick and choose what upgrades and tools you want for not just your main character, but Ochi as well. For Ochi's upgrades, you use pup drive points, which are accumulated by rescuing and saving castaways, and restoring leaflings. And the general upgrades are purchased with raw materials, which are scattered around areas. This material is also used to build bridges and climbing walls, so don't spend all your material on upgrades. Make sure to keep at least 30 when you're shopping the upgrades. I think this is much better than randomly finding an upgrade in the wild, especially as you can pick and choose what upgrades to get first. While the main game doesn't need much day-to-day planning, you eventually gain access to Olimar's Shipwreck Tale, which is the B-plot that's happened before the main game, and actually puts up some sort of challenge for the day limit format of Pikmin 1 and 3. You have 15 days to collect all 30 parts, meaning you need to collect an average of 2 parts a day instead of 1. You start with no upgrades, no dog, and just a handful of reds, and you do gain access to all of those throughout the run, but you really learn to appreciate them when you have them again. I really like that this mode has more looming stress with its shorter day limit, and it really feels like every choice you make has even more weight behind it compared to 1, and the fact that it's shorter means that this game is even more replayable. You unlock some final expert Dandori challenges after beating the Shipwreck Tale. While they took me a fair amount of time to beat, they're not that difficult. Yeah, there's one part where auto lock-on can really mess with you, but again, if you've gotten used to it over your playthrough, it's not that bad. Now for the final Pikmin balancing. Glow Pikmin function just like Bulbmin, meaning they're immune against all elemental hazards, but you can spawn them in whenever, so they're better. The only other new type are Ice Pikmin. As they attack, they can eventually freeze an enemy, which stuns them but will not produce a corpse upon death. Sound familiar? Yeah, this is more or less like 2's Bitter Sprays, but better balanced, as they have to be one of the 3 types that you take out. More on that in a second. And it's not as instant as the sprays, you have to build up the bar in order to stun them. All the other types are back from the first 3 games, which is definitely a choice, but you can only have 3 different types out of the onion at a time. You might start to feel anxious that you'd bring unusable types with you for a given area, but there is an auto button. You can press this at the onion or when entering or exiting a cave, and it will always suggest the correct types for the given area. I'm really torn about this. It seems like they wanted to simplify things for inexperienced players, but you eventually realize that yeah, any given area is really only suited for 3 specific types anyways. I kind of feel like they just brought all the types back for the sake of marketing, but didn't know how to properly balance them to make them all equally useful without being arbitrary. They even made it so then you can move the base around the overworld, which would make switching between more than 3 types easier. But again, all the areas are more or less built for 3 specific types that you can find out just by hitting auto. I do think 5 total types is the sweet spot. The standard red, blue, yellow, and 2 new types. Anything more than that seems like overkill. I do appreciate how you have to build up your Pikmin limit. In all the other games, you can have up to 100 out at a time, 60 in 3 Deluxe's Ultra Spicy mode, but in 4, you can only take 20 out at the start, and you can increase that by 10 by collecting Flarlic bulbs. The onion also can't make more than a given type if you haven't found that type's onion. Some Pikmin types you can actually find without encountering their onion, meaning that caves and candy pop buds are the only way to get more of that type until you find their respective onion. I really like those 2 changes, as it gives an even heightened sense of progression along with the upgrade system, and it makes what were easy to come by types in other games now more of a precious resource for a stent. Overall, I like how much Pikmin 4 adds and refines the Pikmin experience. Yeah, there's some contentious things like auto lock-on and the type limit, and how enemies won't ever respawn in the overworld but will respawn in the caves after you complete them. But I'd say this is my favorite of the series hands down. It caters to fans of the cave gameplay of 2 while making them less stressful, mostly, and provides an actually impactful day limit mode similar to 1 and 3. It would be nice if, say, there was a hard mode just like in 3 Deluxe, but it's not that big of a deal. The game does go on longer than any of the others, I just wanted more when I was done. I'm kind of hoping there's even just a DLC pack of more Dandori missions like there was in the original 3, but I'm also okay with this just being a finished game in this day and age of endless content updates and seasonal battle passes. It's okay to just play a game, be done with it, and move on with your life. While 4 is my favorite, I still appreciate every game and what it brings to the table. The isolating feel and impending doom of 1, the chaotic and sinister caves of 2, the focus on multitasking with 3, and taking all the best of those games and adding so much more in 4. While 1 especially can be jank, it's not that big of a deal breaker. I do think the difficulty of 2 is way overblown, but that doesn't mean it doesn't put up a challenge. The challenge mode of 3 is really where your general gameplay is put to the test, and 4 does a really good job with catering to the widest swath of players possible, and is genuinely the game I'd recommend newcomers try first. I know some like to say you should play them in release order, just so then you can appreciate the improvements in subsequent titles, but the occasional jank and heightened difficulty of these first 2 might discourage newbies from continuing to experience the series. I'd say play 3 and 4 first, then 1, then 2. There's always the free demos of 3 and 4 on the Switch eShop if you want to get a taste of Pikmin. With these demos, you can even carry your progress to the full game if you decide to pick them up. So there's literally no downside to giving them a shot. Yeah, I have nothing for this ending, so see ya.